The quiet Saturday dawn wrapped the park in a light mist. Robert Weston, a tall black man with a strong build and a confident stride, moved along the winding paths shaded by trees. His face was focused, his breathing steady. Every step was precise, honed by years of training, first in the military and later through his long career in law enforcement. For him, this wasn't just a way to stay fit, but also a chance to clear his mind before a busy day. As always, Robert wore a simple yet functional outfit, a light gray t-shirt, dark shorts, and high-quality running shoes designed for long-distance runs. A small fitness tracker on his wrist glimmered faintly, tracking his mileage. He knew this route by heart, every turn, every bench, every incline. The park was his retreat, a space where he could simply be a runner, free from titles or responsibilities. On the quiet path, Robert noticed a white patrol car parked near the curb. 2 police officers stood beside it. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a blonde crew cut, leaned casually against the hood, chewing gum lazily. The other, slightly shorter with short chestnut hair, held a dog leash in his hands, though there wasn't a single pet in sight. Out of habit, Robert gave them a brief nod of acknowledgement as he jogged past without slowing down. There was no reason to stop or explain anything. His morning run didn't break any rules. But to his surprise, the officers didn't return the gesture. Instead, their gazes followed him, lingering longer than simple courtesy would require. Robert felt their stares, sharp and assessing, but he chose to ignore them. He continued running, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing, but a faint unease began to rise in his chest. It was a familiar feeling, almost instinctual. Over the years, he had learned to recognize subtle signs of tension in his surroundings that often hinted at trouble. And now, something about the officer's demeanor set off quiet alarms in his mind. As he completed another lap and returned to the same path, the officers were still there. This time, however, their postures seemed more deliberate, as if they had been waiting for him to come back. When he got closer, the tall blonde officer stepped forward and raised a hand, signaling him to stop. "Hey there, buddy," the officer called out with a slight smirk. His tone was friendly, but there was an undercurrent of mockery. "Where are you off to in such a hurry?" Robert slowed to a stop, adjusting his breathing as he looked at the man. "Just out for a run," he replied evenly. "Just running, huh?" the shorter officer said, stepping closer. He toyed with the leash in his hand, spinning it lazily around his fingers. His eyes scanned Robert from head to toe, studying him. "Yes, it's part of my routine," Robert added, taking a small step to the side, hoping to continue his route. "Is there a problem?" The question hung in the air for a moment as the officers exchanged a glance. But instead of stepping aside, the blonde officer smirked and leaned toward his partner. "Not really," he said slowly. "We just don't see many lone runners around here. Do we, Mike?" "Nope," his partner replied, his tone deliberately drawn out, as if to prolong the moment. Robert felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had been in situations like this before, and knew exactly how they could escalate. His inner voice reminded him to stay calm, to avoid giving them any reason to escalate further. But the looks on their faces told him this encounter wasn't going to end easily. Robert stood still, observing every move the officers made. He knew he had done nothing wrong, yet the smug expressions on their faces told a different story. Their body language, the smirks, the exchanged glances, felt less like a casual interaction and more like a game where they were the ones making the rules. "You're out here alone, huh?" the blonde officer asked, stepping closer. "Training for something big? Or just running for fun?" The question sounded casual, almost friendly, but the tone didn't match the words. Robert noticed the other officer, the one with the leash, moving slightly to the side, as if trying to circle him. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost as though testing Robert's reaction. "Just running for myself," Robert replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Is there an issue with that?" "Oh no, no issues," the officer with the leash replied, raising his hand slightly as if in mock surrender. "We're just being thorough. Never know who might be wandering around the park this early, right? Ain't that right, Jake?" he added, glancing at his partner. "Yeah, Mike," the blonde officer responded with a smirk. "Gotta stay vigilant, especially with people popping up out of nowhere. You can never be too careful these days." Their words were filled with thinly veiled insinuations, and Robert knew it. He kept his composure, refusing to rise to the bait, but he felt his patience wearing thin. Years of experience had taught him how to navigate situations like this, yet the knot in his chest tightened with every passing second. Then the blonde officer, Jake, suddenly shifted gears. "You like dogs, don't you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly as if the question were innocent. Robert frowned slightly, confused by the change in topic. "What?" he asked, his tone measured. "Dogs," Jake repeated, gesturing toward the leash in his partner's hands. "You know, the kind that runs with their owners. A lot of folks around here bring their dogs to jog with them, but you're out here solo. That's a shame. We were just thinking." He paused for effect, glancing at his partner. "Maybe we could help you out." "Oh yeah," Mike chimed in, spinning the leash between his fingers. "It's a real shame to run without a leash, don't you think?" Robert looked at them, his calm expression not betraying the irritation growing inside him. He understood exactly where this was going. This wasn't just a joke, it was a deliberate provocation, and they were enjoying it. "I don't think that's a good idea," Robert said firmly, locking eyes with Mike, who had now moved even closer. "Come on, man, it's just a little fun," Mike said with a smirk, his tone dripping with false camaraderie. "You're not against a little harmless fun, are you?" Before Robert could step away or object further, Mike moved swiftly, tossing the leash over Robert's neck. The plastic strap rested loosely at first, but the action was deliberate and confident, as if he'd done it 100 times before. Jake let out a laugh, clearly entertained. "There we go," Jake said with mock enthusiasm. "Now you're ready for the big race." Robert stood his ground, his expression neutral, but his gaze icy. He slowly reached up and touched the leash, his fingers brushing against it with controlled deliberation. His breathing remained steady, though he could feel the adrenaline rising. "Take this off," Robert said quietly, his voice calm but laced with steel. "Relax, buddy," Mike said with a laugh, holding the end of the leash in his hand. "It's just a joke. No harm, no foul." Jake added, "Yeah, man, you gotta lighten up. Not everything's gotta be so serious, you know?" Robert didn't respond immediately. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on Mike, who now seemed slightly less sure of himself. Jake's grin faltered slightly as well under Robert's unflinching stare. "You have no idea what you're doing," Robert said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "But I'll give you one chance to stop. Take this off. Now." Jake laughed nervously, trying to brush off the tension. "What's the big deal? It's just a piece of plastic." "It's not the plastic," Robert replied sharply. "It's what it represents, and you just made a very bad decision." The tone of his voice silenced Jake and Mike for a moment, but the blonde officer quickly regained his composure. "What are you gonna do about it?" Jake asked, smirking again. "Call your lawyer?" Robert didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. Both officers stiffened slightly, their eyes flicking to his hand. When Robert pulled out a small leather case and flipped it open, the shiny FBI badge inside caught the light. "You just put a dog leash on the neck of the deputy director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Robert said, his tone calm but cold. "And now we're going to talk about what happens next." The smirks vanished instantly. Jake's face paled, and Mike's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, neither of them spoke, their confidence evaporating as the weight of Robert's words settled over them. We didn't know," Mike stammered, dropping the end of the leash as though it had burned him. "It was a mistake, a joke." "A joke?" Robert repeated, his voice cutting through their excuses like a blade. "If this is your idea of a joke, then you're in the wrong profession. And trust me, I'm going to make sure you learn that lesson." Robert stood motionless, feeling the leash resting around his neck. His expression remained calm, but his eyes were sharp and piercing. He knew this was no longer about the leash itself. It was about their intent, their mockery, and their abuse of authority. Every instinct told him not to escalate the situation, but his patience was wearing thin. Jake, the blonde officer, leaned back slightly, hands still in his pockets, smirking as though nothing was out of place. His partner, Mike, nervously spun the loose end of the leash around his fingers, but his expression showed faint uncertainty. For a moment, none of them spoke, and the silence grew heavier with each passing second. "You're looking a little tense." Jake finally broke the quiet, his tone dripping with mock concern. "It's just a joke, buddy. Relax." Robert slowly raised a hand to the leash, gripping it lightly. His movements were measured, deliberate, but his voice was firm when he spoke. "Take this off," he said quietly, his tone calm but commanding. "Now." Mike let out a small laugh, but it was strained, his confidence faltering. "Come on, man. It's just a little fun. Don't take it so seriously." Robert didn't flinch, his gaze boring into Mike. "If you think this is fun, then you don't understand the position you're in. I'm giving you one chance to stop." Jake stepped closer, crossing his arms. "Oh, we're in a position now, huh?" he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What are you gonna do, call a friend? Tell on us?" Robert's gaze shifted to Jake, his expression unchanging. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket. His movements were slow and deliberate, but the effect was immediate. Both officers straightened slightly, their eyes flicking to his hand. Their smug expressions wavered, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed their faces. Robert pulled out a small leather case and opened it. The silver badge inside gleamed in the morning sunlight, its bold letters unmistakable, FBI. "You just put a leash on the neck of the Deputy Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Robert said, his voice steady and cold. "And now you're going to explain yourselves." The silence that followed was deafening. Jake's smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Mike froze, his mouth slightly open, as if trying to form words but finding none. "Wait, you're... what?" Jake stammered, his usual bravado replaced by confusion and fear. "You're FBI?" "That's right," Robert replied, his tone cutting. "And you just made a very serious mistake." Mike dropped the end of the leash as though it had suddenly become red hot. His hands shook slightly as he stepped back, raising them defensively. "Sir, we didn't know," he stuttered. "It was just, we thought you were just..." "Just what?" Robert interrupted, his voice low but forceful. "Someone you could harass? Someone you could humiliate for your own amusement? Is that what you thought?" Jake opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it again, his face pale. The realization of their actions was beginning to set in, and neither of them seemed to know how to recover. "It was a misunderstanding," Mike said quickly, his words tumbling over each other. "We didn't mean anything by it. It was just a joke." "Stop talking," Robert said firmly, silencing him immediately. He adjusted his stance slightly, standing taller, his presence even more commanding. "This isn't a joke. This is a gross abuse of authority, and you're both going to face the consequences." Before either officer could respond, the quiet was broken by the sound of a car approaching. A sleek silver sedan pulled up alongside the patrol car, its engine purring softly before shutting off. The door opened, and out stepped a man in a dark suit, his expression stern and composed. Robert recognized him instantly. Walter Gray, a senior agent from the local FBI office. Walter surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes quickly taking in Robert's calm but tense demeanor, the leash hanging loosely around his neck, and the pale, frozen faces of the two officers. His jaw tightened, and he stepped forward. "What's going on here?" Walter asked, his voice steady but firm. Jake and Mike turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of fear and confusion. Walter's gaze shifted to Robert, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he noticed the leash. "Take that off him," Walter said sharply, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. We already," Mike began, but Walter silenced him with a glare. "I said, take it off. Now," Walter repeated. Mike hurriedly reached forward, fumbling to remove the leash from Robert's neck. Once it was off, Robert calmly took it from Mike's hand and held it for a moment before dropping it to the ground. "Agent Weston," Walter said, addressing Robert directly, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," Robert replied evenly, his gaze still fixed on the two officers. "But they're not." Walter turned back to Jake and Mike, his expression cold and unreadable. "You two, inside your car. Now, I'll be with you shortly." The officers didn't argue. Heads down, they retreated to their vehicle, their shoulders slumped as they climbed inside. Walter watched them go before turning back to Robert. "What do you want to do about this?" Walter asked quietly. Robert took a moment to consider his response. He glanced at the leash on the ground, then at the patrol car where the two officers sat, their faces pale and filled with dread. "Let's make sure they never forget this lesson," Robert said finally, his voice steady, "and that no one else ends up in their position." Robert watched as the two officers retreated to their patrol car, their confident swagger replaced by slumped shoulders and pale faces. For a moment the park was still, save for the faint rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. He felt the tension in his chest begin to ease, but knew the situation was far from over. What had started as an ordinary run had turned into a stark reminder of the abuse of authority he had spent years fighting against. Walter Gray, the senior FBI agent, remained by Robert's side, his sharp eyes fixed on the patrol car. His composed demeanor betrayed no outward emotion, but Robert knew Walter well enough to recognize the tightly controlled anger behind his silence. "You sure you're okay?" Walter asked, his voice calm but serious. "I'm fine," Robert replied, brushing his neck where the leash had been moments before. "They're the ones who aren't." Walter's gaze shifted to the leash lying discarded on the ground. He bent down, picked it up, and studied it for a moment before slipping it into a small evidence bag from his pocket. He sealed the bag with a practiced motion and straightened. "This is going on record," Walter said firmly. "They're going to learn the hard way that their actions have consequences." Robert nodded but remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the patrol car. Through the windshield, he could see the two officers sitting stiffly in the front seats, avoiding each other's eyes. He could almost feel their panic radiating from the car. "Let me talk to them first," Walter said, breaking the silence. "I'll handle the immediate response. You've already done more than enough to make your point." "Go ahead," Robert replied, his tone measured. "I'll be here if you need anything." Walter gave him a brief nod before striding toward the patrol car. As he approached, both officers scrambled to straighten up in their seats, their nervous energy palpable. Walter knocked sharply on the driver's side window, and Jake, the blonde officer, hesitated before rolling it down. "Out of the car," Walter ordered, his voice cold and authoritative. Jake and Mike exchanged a brief panicked glance before obeying, stepping out and standing awkwardly in front of Walter. They looked like children caught misbehaving, their confidence from earlier completely shattered. "What do you have to say for yourselves?" Walter asked, his arms crossed as he stared them down. We didn't know who he was," Jake stammered, his usual bravado replaced by a shaky, defensive tone. "It was just a mistake, a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Walter repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. "You thought it was appropriate to put a leash around someone's neck as part of a misunderstanding? Do you think that justifies your behavior?" "It was a joke," Mike blurted out, his words tumbling over each other. "We didn't mean anything by it. We weren't trying to..." "To what?" Walter interrupted sharply, cutting him off. "To humiliate him? To provoke him? Or were you just hoping he'd retaliate so you'd have an excuse to escalate things?" Both officers froze, unable to respond. Walter stepped closer, his presence towering over them despite his calm tone. "Do you have any idea who you just tried to intimidate?" Walter asked, his voice low but forceful. "He's not just an FBI agent, he's one of the most senior law enforcement officials in the country. And if he weren't, would that make your actions any less reprehensible?" Jake and Mike looked at the ground, their faces flushed with shame. Walter let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "You're both going to be held accountable for this," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "I've already documented the incident. There will be an internal investigation, and I can assure you, your excuses won't hold up." Mike opened his mouth to protest but quickly closed it again under Walter's glare. Jake shifted uncomfortably, but neither of them spoke. Meanwhile, Robert had resumed a slow jog along the park's perimeter, his thoughts racing despite his outward calm. The leash around his neck was gone, but the weight of the situation still lingered. It wasn't the first time he had faced an abuse of power, but it was a stark reminder of why his work mattered. He finished his loop and returned to where Walter was wrapping up his conversation with the officers. Walter looked up as Robert approached, his expression softening slightly. "It's done," Walter said, stepping away from the officers who now stood by their car, visibly shaken. "They'll face a full inquiry. Their careers might not survive this." Robert nodded, his gaze briefly flicking to the officers. "Good. They need to understand that this isn't just a slap on the wrist." "They do now," Walter assured him. "Anything you want to add before we close this out?" Robert paused for a moment, considering his words carefully. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Make sure this isn't just about them," he said. "This isn't just two bad apples. It's about what allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. If they lose their jobs but nothing changes, it's not enough." Walter nodded solemnly. "You have my word. This is going higher up the chain." As the officers climbed back into their patrol car under Walter's direction, Robert turned and began walking toward the park's exit. The air was still cool, and the morning was as quiet as it had been when he first arrived. But everything felt different now. This wasn't just another incident. It was a reminder that justice wasn't always swift or easy, but it was necessary. For Robert, this was one more small battle in a much larger fight, one he was determined to win.